Thomas Jefferson was a little bit reluctant because he felt actually that it was unconstitutional because it was something that states should take care of, not the national government. And a man who actually, I think, came originally from Switzerland, Albert Gallatin, who served in Jefferson's cabinet, was the impetus behind the founding of this road. And he convinced Jefferson that this was a good idea.
Hi, I'm Ayla Sparks, and this is Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers. From ancient relics to modern marvels, each episode of the show features a new museum and a curator's choice of some amazing artifacts housed there. These guardians of history will share insights, anecdotes, and the often untold stories that breathe life into the artifacts they protect. Thanks for tuning in to this Mighty Oak Media production, and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of Curator's Choice. Today on the show, we are going down the highway through history as we unravel the fabric of America's love affair with her roads. This is a very special episode because we are using it to feature the National Road Museum, which will be opening its doors later this year. So it's very exciting, and we're speaking with guest Bob Savitt, and we'll be discovering the various innovations in road development that helped create the National Road. We'll be taking a dive into some road building techniques that have withstood the sands of time, as well as learning about America's first rest stops in the form of mile markers. Without further ado, let's fasten those seatbelts and get ready for an amazing ride.
Sadly, I've always loved roads.
Nerd alert. That's all right. You're among nerds.
Yeah, and I grew up in the New York City area, and we didn't have many of these nice old roads there. So when I got down here, just discovered the National Road, and as I mentioned, my wife and I traveled the full length of the loneliest road in America in Nevada, US Route 50.
50, yeah.
And so I've met a few other people who, strangely enough, love roads, and I understand there's a whole movement. In Maryland, we have in Frederick County, there's a Rural Roads Commission, and basically the idea is to save as many of the old original roads in the county as possible.
So you've found all of the other road nerds and you've collected them all together.
Absolutely.
So what's incredibly exciting is you guys are going to be opening up a new museum, and it's a really big deal. I feel like more often, especially nowadays, museums in the news are closing, or it's because someone destroyed an artifact of some kind. But there should be way more news that they are opening. So if you're opening up the new museum, it's here in Boonesboro. And why in the world Boonesboro? Because I thought that it was a fake name, kind of like Funktown.
I can't tell you the entire history because it goes back about 19 years from when this whole thing started, this idea of having a museum here.
Long time coming.
In 2005, it was not really dedicated to the National Road. It was named the National Road Foundation because we happened to be right along the National Road. So it wasn't until about 7 years later that the idea arose that we really should have a museum dedicated to the National Road, since it was the first federally funded highway in America, like the first interstate. And I joined the board here about maybe 3 years ago, and very exciting for us. We're actually going to open up this October, and we won't have every bell and whistle in place, but we felt that we had enough interesting things that this was the time to get it going.
And that's a good thing about a lot of museums, especially now, is it's better if they're not static. It's better if you just create a museum and then you have all your artifacts and then it stays that way for the next 30 years. That's not of interest. You're never going to get repeated people coming back. And usually they're just big panels of writing without anything tangible. So I think you say that almost like it's, we're not entirely ready, but I think that's the perfect way to start a museum, because then no matter what, you have a revolving door of new and exciting things coming in for people.
Right. We will definitely have something like that as we mature and get additional exhibits in. There's lots of wonderful ideas that we hope to bring to fruition, but right now we're going to open up with what we have, and we think it's very interesting for most folks.
And for what I've seen, you guys have a lot of really cool things. So just in case there might be some road naysayers out there, if someone were to ask you, why roads? Why are roads interesting, and why a museum about roads? Or one road in particular, what would you say?
That's a good question. I think roads are interesting because of their origins. Why were they built? I live in Frederick County, and we have a lot of roads there that have people's names on them. And one of the projects that I hope someone will work on someday is to do biographies of these folks. Why is this road named after them? And the answer in most cases is going to be because he lived there, and the road happened to lead to his homestead. But on the national scale, just every road has its own little story. We talked a minute ago about Route 50 in Nevada being the loneliest highway in America because it goes through towns that just sprung up, have really not changed a whole lot over the years.
There's no moisture in the air to destroy any woods,
Exactly.
so it
Exactly.
exists forever.
And a road like this, the National Road, has such historic background to it. It was built because we needed a way to basically populate the western part of the U.S. at that time, going into the Ohio Valley. And the only way to really get it going would be through using national funds rather than local funds, because local funds didn't much exist then. And so the movement to start this was during Thomas Jefferson's administration, and a man who actually I think came originally from Switzerland, Albert Gallatin, who served in Jefferson's cabinet, was the impetus behind the founding of this road. And he convinced Jefferson that this was a good idea. Jefferson was a little bit reluctant because he felt actually that it was unconstitutional because it was not something, it was something that states should take care of, not the national government. But Congress passed it. In 1806, they began to work on the road. In 1811 is when it really began, hit the gravel on it, and started moving from Cumberland, Maryland to the west. We call the National Road now from Baltimore out west because at the same time that the National Road was being built, roads in this area were being developed, and they were developed by private stock companies financed by banks. And they charged tolls, and the idea was that if you invested in one of these, you might make a few bucks. So the banks got behind it, and we call them bank roads, and there were a series of them from Baltimore to Cumberland. Now, in the 1830s, when the federal government turned over the national part of the road to each of the individual states, the whole length of it began to be called the National Road, the National Pike. It has lots of different names, but that's really where it all came from.
An interesting side note that would be really fantastic for someone to do a biography on is there is a lovely road in Nevada, one of my hometowns, that's the Polecat Road. Oh. Nevada being famous for a few select deeds. A very interesting name there. But this museum in its whole, the goal is to tell the story of roads in the United States, and basically it can be extrapolated to anywhere there are roads in the world. But also when you're focusing and saying the National Road, you're specifically talking about that section between Baltimore and...
The purists will tell you that the National Road is really the road from Cumberland to Vandalia, Illinois. That was the original charter.
That was the one that was the first federally funded road.
Exactly. Actually, it was supposed to be funded to Wheeling and then eventually spread down to Vandalia. And then over the years, connecting roads sprung up. And so the National Road could actually be from Baltimore all the way to the West Coast. But again, always in different segments.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I think of road and road development, I immediately always think of those pictures in the old school books of Roman roads and the different layers of this year of Roman laying them down and the next and then the next. So you have a really amazing painting downstairs that kind of explains this, but it's not Roman road, it's a different kind of road. So can you start telling us a little bit about the evolution of what the roads look like, and then how it culminated in what you can see in this photograph, or this artist rendition, I should say?
Okay. The original road that wasn't dirt were probably the Roman roads way back. And if you look at them, they were basically large stones clumped together. And I can imagine what it must have been like with any wheeled vehicle going over it. And I mentioned to you before, there's a television show that's been on about 8 or 9 years now. It takes place in Nova Scotia. It's on the History Channel, so it's real. And they've discovered on this island where they were looking for buried treasure that there was a buried road which looks very much like the Roman original road. That takes us a little off topic here, but then going further in time, the original roads here in America were similar to that. They were rock roads after they became dirt roads. It went from dirt to a very rocky type of road. And in 1823, they began right here in Boonesboro what most of us now call Macadam roads. Macadam was a Scotsman who developed a way of building roads which were much smoother and much more durable, consisting of broken rocks basically, and it's a lot more complicated than that. There was drainage along the sides, but the first road in the United States made of macadam began here in Boonesboro, and it went all the way out to Hagerstown. And at that point, we were still bank roads. The federal government still owned the road from Cumberland on. And the macadam essentially spread to the rest of the country. And it's not something like an asphalt road, but it's a whole lot smoother than the old Roman roads. So it was quite an advancement.
Would you consider Roman roads, are they cobblestone, or is cobblestone just
It's sort of like cobblestone, but even less developed than cobblestone. If you look at it, it looks like stones that I'd say would be maybe 7 or 8 inches in circumference, just clumped together in a roadbed. And the purpose of it was to avoid what happens when rain hits dirt roads. So it was an advancement in that sense. It was very difficult to build. You had to have a lot of heavy laborers putting in the work there. And as I said, I can't imagine driving up one of these roads without shaking your head into a concussion.
I'm assuming they didn't have the best shocks back then. Although I did cover in a previous episode the development of shocks on horseless carriages, which is pretty interesting. So what are the different kinds of roads, right? We talked about the Roman style development. We talked about cobblestone. We've talked about macadam.
Yes.
Macadam roads. We know asphalt. Are those the basic types of roads?
Those are essentially it. There were even advancements in macadam roads. In 1823, when they first came over here, workmen would literally sit in the roadbed pounding on these larger stones to make them the right size, because macadam process is small and big stones in a certain configuration.
So Macadam 2.0.
Yeah, right. Right. And in those days, after you first laid it, it was still pretty rough. But the way they would smooth it down and make it more durable was through horse-drawn.
Like a brambler?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what the word would be. Sort of a roller mechanism. And that would be the first thing you would do. And that would get the road bed into sort of a stable condition. And then they depended on local traffic to finish the road. And I was mentioning before that when they started charging tolls on these roads, the charges were made according to, in the case of animals, big and small, and in the case of wheeled vehicles, those with the wider edges to them, large vehicles, were charged lower tolls than the ones that were narrower. And that was because the narrower ones messed up the road a bit, way more than the wide bed roads.
That is interesting.
And then macadam advanced. Some of the later pictures that we have here in the museum show you mechanized rollers, very, very heavy, that would go over the stones and compact it in a way that was much smoother. And these are the precursors to what we see today on the highways. Now, of course, we have concrete roads in some areas. We have what I would call macadam, but probably they're made of other materials than in the old days, which are much smoother.
I can't remember who told me this, but I think it was my husband, but asphalt roads are some of the most recyclable materials that we make, correct? Because you can just break apart an asphalt road and completely reuse it in the exact same way.
Exactly.
So it's almost 100% recyclable.
But it's very interesting. I live in a rural area, and the road that leads to our house is about a third of a mile, and it's mostly dirt. And we pile little stones on top of it. But we kept having it every time there was a hard rain, we'd get erosion and it would get ruined. Someone suggested to us to use, I think they call them tailings. Basically, it's broken down asphalt that you can buy. You put it on your road, you compact it, hopefully on a hot day, it's better, and that holds the surface better. So you can recycle it in a number of different ways. Sadly, our road was so bad that even the tailings ultimately failed. But it was very interesting.
That kind of sounds like you were also making a macadam road almost, right? Taking the little pieces, or a different process?
You would need more stones.
Oh, instead of
than
the asphalt.
in
Okay.
this case.
Going back to the macadam design, you guys have the art image. Describe what people can see if they do come into the museum to see this representation of a macadam road being built.
It's really a wonderful painting. You'll see workmen sitting in a roadbed. You'll see various sized stones that they're sitting on, and they're holding other stones and with little hammers banging it into the proper size to create the great formula that Mr. Macadam came up with. You'll also see along the sides, you see the drainage that went into it, and it was pretty complicated. And in between, you would have places where the water could get down and basically go under the road. And then in the background on this painting, you'll see the old horse-drawn wagon with the roller on it, and you can see back out there, it's smoother, way smoother than it is where the guys are pounding away on the stones. The foreman here is looking through, these measuring loops came in different sizes because the stones that had to be put on a macadam road were of different sizes. And there's a supervisor holding one of the stones, and it looks like maybe his boss is holding this gizmo that measures it, and they're looking to make sure that it's the correct size to make the macadam road.
So yeah, you can see, because we have the painting right here, which if you want to see it, you will have to come to the museum because of ownership rights currently, which we can talk about in a minute. But what's cool is you can see, like you said, there's a little foreman there who's got a metal round, almost like an eyeglass that doesn't have glass in the middle of it. Did they have multiple of those to measure the size of the rock?
Yeah, and the larger stones were, as you can see in the picture here, they were pretty sizable. But the smaller stones, which showed the underlying area, they're almost like a little bigger than the number 57 size, if any of you have ever had to put stones on a road. And then it's built up from there. And it turned out to be quite durable, and which is why they decided to go through the added expense at the beginning of putting this down, because in the long run, they lasted a whole lot longer.
You hired an artist specifically to create this painting for the museum.
What the artist actually did was, there was a painting very similar to this in most respects, but it didn't have the type of detail that showed you exactly what was going on and how they were doing it. And so what the artist did is he took the original and he used it as the basis for creating this painting. And as you said, 2.0. It's much more detailed than the original and much more informative.
I'm just going to jump in here to give a little credit where credit is due. So this painting was painted in 2018 by Richard Schlecht. He has done work for the National Geographic magazine, the National Park Service, the Postal Service, and many different organizations across the country. This piece is an original commissioned painting for the museum. However, because of funding, currently they purchased the right to use and display an enlargement of the artwork. They opted to do this so they could open the museum with more on offer, but perhaps with support from people like you, they can one day purchase the artwork in its entirety and proudly display it at the museum. All right, back to the show.
Are there any remaining Macadam roads that you can find in the area? And was this the original national road was created?
This was about 10 miles it went, and it probably was almost experimental because even in Europe, the Macadam process was relatively new. And it was successful, but still more expensive. Mind you, this is on the non-national portion of the road. This is one of the bank roads at the time that painting was depicting. And ultimately, the rest of the road became macadamized, but it was through a gradual process. In the photographs we have here in the museum of more modern times, you'll see that the road, the national road it went into decline, is what I would say, in around the 1850s, because the railroads and the canals were coming through, and they proved to be a better way of moving goods and people westward. And so between 1850 and about 1890, the roads were pretty much ignored. And in fact, there's a wonderful article in an 1879 edition of Harper's Magazine where a gentleman decided to take a trip along what was the national road in deteriorating form. And it's a very amusing article because he describes what the towns were like after the road went into decline and tells a few interesting anecdotes. But along around the late 1880s, early 1890s, bicycles became quite popular in the United States. And again, we have some wonderful pictures of the old type of bicycle. But it became such a strong movement that there was a sort of a lobbying effort called the Good Roads Movement to improve the highways and roadways in areas of the country, mostly in the East, which was successful. And the roads were improved. And then with the advent of automobiles in the early 1900s, and as they gained in popularity, there was increasing legislation to make these roads much more passable, much less difficult on wheels and on automobile suspension systems. And that's basically how the modern roads evolved.
It makes sense too. You want good roads so you can do more commerce more quickly and move bodies and move products quicker.
And in the early days of automobile travel, the roads function, national roads function shifted. It wasn't the essential way to get your goods to market or to get them further west. It became a pastime. Americans fell in love with automobiles. They needed to be decent roads to take your family on a vacation.
Pleasurable.
And in its heyday, which I would say would be from about the 1910s to maybe the 1950s, if you went on our stretches of the National Road, you would find at the top of each of the little peaks that marked the road these very interesting motels. Those were the rudimentary days of motels, with gift shop type things, very, very much touristy type stuff. Some of them even had observation towers on them. But you take the family out if you wanted to just do it for a day. Because these facilities were available, it became possible. And then when it became apparent that people would like to even take more than just a day trip, you saw the essential beginnings of motels springing up. Sadly, now, if you go to most of these peaks, you won't see much. There are a few with the buildings still standing, but you have to look at the old photographs to really get a sense of what it must have been like during the heyday of it. The road is still very much used.
Or you could also always come to the museum if you would
Exactly.
like to see what it was like as well. So another thing, whenever you're traveling on the roads, as anyone who's listening to this podcast has done many times before, you will see mile markers. And you have one of the original National Road mile markers.
Yes, and there are quite a few of them still in existence. There was a book maybe 10 years ago of a gentleman, I think he was from Baltimore, who documented the ones that still exist. and told a little story about each in a little book that he put together. There's another interesting part of this as time went on for real roadies who wanted to know what the National Road and the bank roads really looked like. They searched for what they call alignments, original alignments. Over the years, the road was diverted for a variety of reasons, sometimes just to make it through an easier gap in the mountains or something like that. And so they abandoned the original road for a little ways until it met up again. And those are called alignments. And in many cases, there was lots of growth over them, so it was difficult to see them. But you can still find areas where you can see what the original road looked like and the direction that it went before they redirected it. And another case, I was doing some research up in a library in Hagerstown, and a gentleman somewhere near the year 2000 went all over the local area and out west in Maryland and took pictures of every alignment, every original alignment he could find, and he documented where they are. Now, in the 20 years since he did that, probably there's been some growth and would be more difficult to find, but it shows you what folks like us who really love roads get into the minutia of development of these roads, and in your mind trying to imagine what it really looked like in the day.
When you're talking about the alignments, I'm assuming one of the great ways that you can try to find those is if you can find those original mile markers.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I'm not sure that's a good point. I wonder how many of the mile markers were found in areas that no longer are part of the original road, and I'm sure there were several. The other thing that sort of popped up every mile or so, in addition to these markers, were taverns and inns. And they varied from inns that, not exactly what you'd think of as today, but more or less luxurious for its time, down to these kind of rowdy places where teamsters would hook up for the evening and try some of the local brew, put their cattle or whatever it was they were driving into some fields that were laid out for them. And there was a time where they said that you couldn't go more than a mile without seeing one of these. And then the corollary to that is the vehicles that went along the road, for example, stagecoaches. There were rudimentary stagecoaches which carried a lot of mail and things like that, but a couple of passengers could fit into it. And they were the base of what passenger vehicles were like in that time, all the way up to the kind of Cadillac of stagecoaches, which were beautiful, lined with padding and leather. You can still see a number of those, for example, in Hagerstown in the Washington County Agricultural Museum. They have restored some of these, and it's quite impressive. And of course, the shocks in those, the springs, were much better, and the ride was much smoother, although never the way a real car would go today.
It makes sense why you wouldn't be able to go more than a mile, because you probably couldn't
That's
stand
right.
to go too often.
Exactly. And the other thing is that for people who really want to trace the National Road today, starting off, let's say, in Baltimore, you can actually stop at taverns along the way that were actually taverns in the day. Some of them have been converted into restaurants. Newmarket, for example, has a restaurant there that was an original tavern. In Cumberland, right before you get to Cumberland, there's a very well-known Italian restaurant, and it sits right along the original alignment of the National Road, and it has a little bar in the basement if you want to really feel like what it was like.
That's awesome.
If you can really transport yourself back to those days, you can actually find buildings along the way that will show you what it was like. So you can really transport yourself back in time if you try hard enough.
Speaking of these areas where you can stop over and take a rest, these mile markers actually used to be technically the first ever rest stops.
Yeah, if you were driving along the road and you need to make a rest stop, or you just wanted to hold off for a few minutes, there was a way for you to hook on to one of these mile markers. It would be your stopping point. You wouldn't want to spend the whole night there.
So these mile markers would have kind of a brass bar where you could tie your horse off to like a hitching post.
Some of them did.
Some of them
and that's
did.
what we suspect was the reason for those.
So I wasn't necessarily much of a roadie before, but I can count myself one now. You changed me into really, this was very interesting and I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for meeting with me.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Curator's Choice, a Mighty Oak Media production. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and rating the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you love a museum and would like to hear it featured in an episode, shoot me a message at curatorschoicepodcast@gmail.com. I'll do my best to reach out and see if I can get them to be on the show. You can also view articles, artifacts, and more by following us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for listening to Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers.